There would be sort of other peoples, though, who would take up sort of different forms of education for indigenous peoples as well, so that not all of the interactions were necessarily horrific or violent per se. And not all indigenous peoples, again, sort of, went willingly. There were a few schools that were burnt, or that were sort of destroyed by peoples because they refused. There was definitely resistance on their part. There was definitely conflict there, and in some cases there wasn't. It sort of depended on each given nation, and that sort of subverts our thinking too, that indigenous peoples, prior lived no conflict or were not in conflict with each other, particularly given how harmony was a part of the goal of education. Yeah. So there's just one last key word that I want to offer to you all, particularly moving forward with the Enlightenment, and that is sort of connecting these two articles and thinking about an epistemological shift. So an epistemological shift is sort of a shift in consciousness, and we would see the first epistemological shift through colonization, because of how colonization again is that forced cultural transplantation, so that indigenous culture and indigenous cultural understandings of education would significantly shift given the arrival of European settlers, and given how school as a concept would be a part of that cultural transplantation. That shift again would be the thing that would equate school with education. And those are sort of the key words that I think sort of help give some context. It's my hope that future teachers sort of consider these readings to think about what, again, the kind of principles they can take away from indigenous education. And if they do decide to take those principles away, how they acknowledge where they come from, right? Because we will see how those principles will return at a later time, but that doesn't necessarily mean that indigenous peoples get credit for those things. I also want future teachers to think about these readings and think about this conversation in considering what are the ways in which we continue that cultural genocide by not talking about indigenous peoples, by our elementary school teachers still teaching a dominant narrative. What are creative ways in which we can expose children to a revisionist narrative that is still age appropriate? And I've had sort of students take up this challenge, and I think they've done a wonderful job, so I know it's possible. It's possible to sort of talk to children about conflict. It's possible to sort of talk to children about the complexities of history, that not everything is grand, that bad things sort of happen. There's a way to talk about that history to children also, and not sort of glorify either group. There's a way to talk about that history with children and to give them tools of critical consciousness. How are we equipping our young children, not just our middle schoolers or our high schoolers, with critical thinking skills, particularly critical thinking skills about history? How are we incorporating indigenous peoples, not just their history, but how they're living today? How are we talking about how they're living today within our classroom conversations, in a math class, in in a music class, in an art class, because it's possible, right? It's possible to do those things. It's sort of about how invested are we in sort of talking about these peoples who, again, it's because of their history. It's because of that history that we're even able to be here, right? Because we're all immigrants at the end of the day, whether we were born in the soil or not. So what are the ways in which we sort of pay homage to that, and not just on Thanksgiving? Because again, Thanksgiving sort of reduces them to museum pieces, as if they only existed during the 1600s, as if they don't exist now, as if their struggles today are not connected to the history of colonization, as if their struggles within education aren't connected to that history either. So these are sort of important takeaways that I want for you as teachers to sort of take away, along with the takeaways that you had as well, and you all had really significant ones. Seeing school as a possible limitation. I think Gustavo did a good job of sort of looking at some of those educational flaws around sort of conformity, or the ways in which schools can possibly take away diversity with that conformity. I was happy to see Daniel begin to see this business and political investment within education, which might be in opposition to some of teachers' intentions for education. And I think that Stephen used a word that, or a phrase rather, that's really important, which is to see this historical moment of early America as a national tragedy, as a national tragedy, particularly for indigenous peoples. And so again, I want to push folks to think, well, how do we continue that tragedy? How do we continue that genocide? We, even as well-meaning people who sympathize and empathize with that history and those peoples, how do we continue that? By not sort of being critically conscious and not sort of bringing them into conversation, by not speaking them into existence, and by not sort of acknowledging the contributions that they've made historically. There were other points. There was one last point that I wanted folks to sort of take away as well. And this was a quote that Brittany had brought into the conversation, which I thought was really important in sort of moving forward. And that is, she didn't cite where she got this from, but I'm assuming that she had gotten it from the Reagan chapter. And it's, the historical context influences contemporary classrooms. The historical context influences contemporary classrooms through institutionalized social relations, educational practices, and goals, all of which may be at odds with Native American community and their perceived educational needs. And so I want us to consider that quote, but also consider that key word of institutionalized. What it means to institutionalize relations. What it means to institutionalize a teacher and student relation. What it means to institutionalize or standardize a curriculum. What it means to standardize assessment. And the ways in which that helps education, particularly as we consider diverse classrooms, particularly as we consider just having to service a lot of people, but then also what that takes away from the education of an individual. Okay, so I look forward to seeing you all on Monday. I hope this was helpful, and yeah, I'm looking forward to continuing this process with you. Thank you and take care.